Back when I was very young, in the 4th grade or so, a friend and I, let's call him Bob, were really adventurous and stupid, to put it in the simplest terms. My elementary school wasn't the best funded school, so we didn't have gates around it preventing trespassing. You could basically waltz your way onto the school grounds, no problem. I heard some rumors about weird things found in the cafeteria and auditorium at our school as a result of this. And I have some stories about that auditorium. Part 1. The first trip. We later found that every once in a while the custodians wouldn't lock the doors to the wings of the building where the auditorium and cafe were when they were doing their jobs. So Bob and I, being young and curious, decided to try to open the main doors, and voila, we were in. We knew that there would be staff on campus, so we were typically quiet and cautious. But we knew one place rumored to be quite odd after school hours. Reminder though, this is when we were really young, so kids like to make things up. But even if the things that they said weren't exactly true, we didn't leave unsatisfied. The cafeteria has a stage auditorium, which has a very musty storage and backstage area alongside the music room. So we ventured around, and once we got backstage, things got creepy, fast. No lights were on, so Bob pulled out his phone, and he turned on the camera light. Immediately we got spooked by half-clothed metallic frames of Santa Claus during the dinner with Santa our school did. I don't know if you've ever seen a half-clothed animatronic thing, but it isn't exactly what you want to see in the dim light of a phone in a musty room. We moved on from that experience, and we didn't find anything except for a few cockroaches that I think should go extinct already, but alas, here we are. Continuing on, we looked around, and there wasn't much. But then we heard somebody walking in the hallway near the backstage entry. We hastily snuck out of the area. Part 2. A scary return. A week or so passes by, and I go over to Bob's house. At the time, he lived right behind my house, which had a sidewalk leading almost directly to the school. I still live here, but sadly he moved away. We played on the Xbox 360 for a bit, and then got a thirst for some more exploration. And luckily, once again, the doors were unlocked. This time we decided to explore a bit deeper into the area, and this is where things really got weird. We walked into the backstage area, but this time it was really humid. There was this smell of feces, and it was horrible. We covered our noses and got to the darker area with the Santa animatronic, but for some reason he was fully clothed and facing the backstage entrance. From what I remember, it was well after December during these trips. We were weirded out by it and almost turned back, but then we heard a custodian moving his cleaning trolley in the hallway. We entered through a small stairwell that the custodian's office was adjacent to, meaning that we would have to go out the other exit. We continued on this time, and I had a small rinky-dink flashlight for extra visibility. Once we were near the other stairwell, we heard a scraping sound. We turned around, and that damn Santa was looking straight at us, but it was like a shadowy-looking thing. The next second, it was back to facing where it was when we had entered. I didn't know if Bob saw it, but I definitely did, and it spooked the hell out of me. I told him that I saw some weird crap behind us, and we decided that this was just a little too creepy, so we snuck out, trying not to alert the staff of our presence. Part 3. The near finale. For the next year or so, we weren't able to talk much because this is when he first started moving. We still hung out, but we didn't go back. So here comes December, and I have Bob and another friend, let's call him Joe, at my house for the weekend. Bob brings up the auditorium again, and by then I had almost forgotten about it. All 3 of us are in, but this time it's practically pitch dark, and since the week just ended, the custodians were working a bit later, allowing for some nighttime adventuring. Now, do note, the cafeteria and auditorium area had windows vertical to the stage, allowing for light to shine in during the daytime. But during later hours, they turned off the lights in the areas that weren't having anything done to them, so it was pitch dark. We head in, but this year they added in fencing near the entrances on both sides of the school. Luckily, I was a skinny 5th grader, so I stuck my skinny arm in and around the fence to open its door, which had a push bar, making it harder but still doable. Now we were in, and sadly the door that leads to the main hall was locked, so we ventured around the school grounds to the library, which wasn't locked. The library had a door at the other end which led straight into the main hallway, allowing us to access what we had now coined the haunted cafeteria. I know, very creative of us. We head in, and this time we decided not to mess around and adventure the entire area. The Santa was in its performance area, and the stage curtains were closed. We ignored him and moved on. We started heading into the storage area. We looked around to see some drama club costumes, and then we smelled that same smell from a year ago. Next thing you know, the light in the room turns on, and naturally it scares us, but it was just a motion sensor light. Then, from the backstage, we hear the Santa laughing and a scraping noise, as if somebody was dragging sandpaper on the tiled ground. We think one of us did it, but we're all standing right next to each other. We go into the backstage again, and we see the Santa doing its dance. It's singing, "You better not cry. You better not pout. I'm telling you why. Santa Claus is coming." And before it even gets to the to-town part, it just stops dancing and singing. Now, we don't know how the hell the custodians deal with this crap because it scares the shit out of us, and we decided to leave, many questions unanswered. 6 years have passed since then, and I'm still clueless as to what the hell was going on. We haven't been there since, and I haven't seen Bob for 4 years. The prologue. That night, I remember walking out of the cafeteria with Bob and Jim, and I always felt like there was something watching us. It may have been paranoia, but I swear that when I turned to look behind us in the hallway with its single light on, there was a shadowy figure that was peeking on us, following us. That night, I remember seeing and hearing some weird stuff at night before I went to sleep. I remember having faint sounds in my head of that same scraping on the ground that occurred before the Santa Claus started to sing. This only happened a few times, though, which eased me, but still made it weird. Every time I take a walk near that school, I always feel like something's behind me or following me, but I've never been able to find out what it is. This is my favorite paranormal story, so I wanted to share. When I first moved to Orlando, I got a job at a local company, and I needed to find a place to live. At the time, I was renting a room from a nice older couple. However, I was also getting married, so I needed to find a place for both of us to live. Those who live in Orlando know how expensive it can be, and I'm not much of an apartment guy. So, finally, we found this nice little house. And when I say little, I mean little. Anyway, the landlord gave us a great deal. He didn't really want to spend any time fixing the place up because it wasn't worth it. After all, it was really small and really old. They had just moved his wife's mother to an elderly home, and he did fix the electrical and plumbing. I agreed that I would paint and fix things up so long as the basics worked. He was a really nice landlord, and we got along great. A few weeks after we moved in, the wife came by and let us know that they would be away for a bit. It turns out her mom passed away a few days prior, and they were taking her back to the old country, as she put it. I felt bad. I didn't know she was that sick, and we moved into her house. After that, nothing seemed out of the ordinary, but the air about the house did change a little, or at least I thought it did. Shortly after, I got married and we settled into our daily lives. I was working on the front porch one day when I found a small brooch under one of the rotten boards. It was pretty nice, so I brought it inside and placed it on the mantel. I figured I would give it to the landlord the next time I saw him, figuring it was most likely either Lillian's, his mother-in-law's, or his wife's. That was when things started to get weird. The first thing I started noticing, or more to the point, my wife noticed and blamed me for, was that the keepsakes from our wedding got moved around. They were never where she'd left them. I told her that I had nothing to do with moving them, but her being her, she wasn't having any of it. So we moved them back. A few days later, we come home from dinner, and there they were, rearranged again. I looked over at her and said, "Okay, how did I do it this time?" The brooch was still there in the same place on the mantle, but everything else had been moved around. This happened a few more times until my wife finally just got over it and left them wherever they were. One day, I was dusting and I came across the brooch on the mantle. I looked at it and a breeze went by. I tried to tell myself it was just the fan, but that got me thinking about all the odd things that had started happening. I started to think that maybe the events were Lillian's doing. I asked my wife what she thought, and she said that I was crazy. She said, "Do you really think the ghost of the old lady that lived here is haunting the house and moving our wedding stuff around?" I said, "Well, yeah." She gave me that look and walked away. Anyway, the following weekend, the landlord came by to mow, and I went outside to give back the brooch, thinking maybe that would change things. His wife was in the truck reading a book, and I walked over and handed the brooch to her. Well, she turned about 10 shades of white and looked up at me and asked where I'd found it. I told her that I found it under the porch when I was fixing the floor. She said that it had been her mother's, and one day she, the daughter, the wife of the landlord, had been outside playing with it and had lost it. Her mother, Lillian, was very mad at her for having played with it and for losing it. She smiled and the color returned to her face. She hugged me, and then I walked back to the house. As I walked up to the front, I looked at the house and noticed that in the front window there was a shadow behind the lace curtains. It looked like a person. As I walked closer, I tripped over a rock, and when I got back up, the person wasn't there. I went into the house and looked around. Didn't see anything. So I moved on, thinking it was a trick of the light through the lace. A few days later, I get home and my wife starts rambling, asking if I smelled the flowers. She also thought we had mice or rats because she kept hearing movement. I told her I didn't smell the flowers. I kind of poked her a bit about it, and I asked her if it sounded like little feet or footsteps. She looks at me and then says, "Footsteps." After that, the events get more frequent and interesting. I'd be sitting on the couch, and I would see out of the corner of my eye movement, or a change of light. Not quite a shadow, but almost going from the kitchen to the bathroom, which is a straight shot. There isn't any light that can move way back there. There were other things, like strange sounds of things moving in the kitchen or the back bedroom. A lot of footsteps. The whole house is hardwood floors, and it really carries. I decided that Lillian was still here, even after the brooch event. Maybe she was happy that I gave it back to her daughter, but it was still her house, so I figured she was well within her rights to live there too. And besides, I loved the way she messed with my wife. She's so easy. It even got to the point where sometimes I would talk to Lillian. I never got a response back, and that was before cell phones or voice recorders were as high-tech as they are now. I'm not sure who she messed with more, me or my wife. We stayed in that house for 6 years and had 2 kids there before we moved on to another city. Shortly after we moved out, the landlord called and asked if anything strange had happened to us while we were in the house. I told him that his mother-in-law was still around and that she was super cool. He then said that's what he thought, because they were in there repainting and running ceiling fans, and they both had run-ins with something strange. I told him that she was good to us and that we miss living there. I hung up the phone, and that was the last time I ever heard from him. I found out a few years later from some friends that the house was torn down and a new house had been put up in its place that was way bigger than the original. I was a bit sad, but then I thought that Lillian might not like that very much, and I hope she rearranges everything in the new house and drives the owners crazy, like she did my wife. I don't have many memories of my father because he died when I was just 8 years old. However, I do clearly remember the night several years later when he let us know that he was still around and watching over us. First of all, you need to know something about my father. He was fascinated by the supernatural and by the possibility of some sort of existence after death. After it became clear that he would soon lose his battle with lymphatic cancer, he told my mother not to worry. He said, "If there's any way for me to reappear after I die, to let you know that I'm okay, then that's what I'm going to do. I'll visit you and the kids all the time. It's going to be so cool." My mother said her response to that was a pointed and succinct, "Don't you effing dare." It wasn't that she didn't care what happened to him after he died, or that she didn't want him watching over us. She just knew that she wasn't going to be able to emotionally deal with that situation, and she promised him that that's how she would react. My father followed through on his promise. The story my mother told us was that she was in their upstairs bedroom a few months after his death, thinking about him and crying because she missed him so much. Then she suddenly had the distinct feeling that she was being watched. She turned her head and saw my father standing outside the bedroom window on the balcony, clear as day. He looked healthy and alive. He was wearing a bright blue suit and gave my mother a look that said, "Is it okay if I come inside?" My mother said she stared at him for a moment in total shock. She deliberately blinked her eyes to make certain that she was really seeing what she was seeing. And when she opened her eyes, he was still there, smiling and waiting. That's when my mother followed through on her promise. She closed her eyes tightly and said out loud, "I can't handle this. I'm sorry, but I need you to go away, and please don't ever do this again." After about 10 seconds, she opened her eyes, and this time he was gone. This next part of the story takes place a few years later, and I kind of have to set the scene for you. I took a bad fall while playing soccer, and the impact totally destroyed my shoulder. I broke it in 2 places, and every ligament and tendon was torn. The reason that this is important to the story is that my shoulder hurt so bad I couldn't easily walk up the stairs to my bedroom, which was across the hall from my parents' bedroom. I was temporarily sleeping in the guest bedroom downstairs, and my brother had the bedroom we shared all to himself. That bedroom was right above the guest bedroom. In the hallway outside the guest bedroom, there was a sideboard with shelves on top and drawers below, and on those shelves was an old mantel clock. It looked a lot like somebody cut off the very top part of a typical grandfather clock, and it was small enough to fit neatly on the shelf. The clock had to be wound every so often with a special key, which was kept in one of the drawers below. And when it was properly wound, the small pendulum would swing back and forth to keep the clock going. My dad loved this clock, and while he was alive, he made sure to wind it so that it never stopped. After his death, though, my mother never wound the clock again, and it eventually did stop. So this clock had been completely silent for years. Late one night, I was trying to go to sleep, but the pain of my injured shoulder was terrible, and it was keeping me awake. Plus, as a kid, I had terrible anxiety. Even with the bedroom door closed to help me feel more secure, I wasn't comfortable sleeping in the unfamiliar surroundings of the guest bedroom, and being the only person downstairs. Just as I was finally feeling like I might be able to sleep, I heard something in the hallway outside the bedroom door. I was immediately freaked out and wide awake because my mother and brother were still upstairs. The stairs in this house were very squeaky, and I knew for a fact that I had not heard anybody walking down them. It sounded as though someone or something was messing around with the sideboard. First, I heard a drawer open and then shut. After that, I heard a loud click, followed by a strange sort of grinding sound. Then there were a couple of more clicks, and suddenly, the clock that hadn't made a sound in years started ticking. That sound I heard before wasn't grinding, it was winding. Someone took the key out of the drawer, opened the clock, wound it, and started the pendulum. Apparently, they also put the key back in the drawer where it belonged, because that's where we found it later. At this point, 11-year-old me was not only wide awake, but I was also scared as hell, and hiding as far beneath my covers as I could go with a broken shoulder. After all, when you're a child, covers are magical and repel all things evil, right? The next thing I heard was somebody walking up the stairs. Then everything was quiet for a short while. Soon, though, I heard footsteps moving around all over the upstairs. I even heard someone directly above me open and close the creaky sliding closet doors in my bedroom. After that, I clearly heard footsteps come down the stairs, someone open and then close the door to the guest room where I was struggling to breathe inside my cover cave, and then soon after, the footsteps returned up the stairs, and finally all was silent, except for one thing. The clock continued with its relentless tick-tock, tick-tock. Eventually, sleep caught up with me, and I didn't wake until my mother came to check on me in the morning. While we were eating breakfast that morning, my mother looked at me and paused for a long time. Finally, she asked, "Were you up and walking around last night?" I told her I was not, and then I described to her all the noises I had heard. My mother told me she heard noises during the night too, and had searched all over the house to see who it was. It was her walking all around upstairs, opening and closing the squeaky closet, coming down the stairs, opening and closing the guest bedroom door, and then going back up. So, who made the other sounds we both heard first, we wondered. And why was that clock ticking? Suddenly, my mother's eyes grew wide. "Oh my goodness," she said. "Last night was the anniversary of the night your dad died. I think it must have been him, trying to let us know that he's still watching over us." And with that, we both went to look at the clock, which was still ticking. "Thanks, Dad. Message received. We love you too, and we miss you." I don't know how long I was out before I came to, strapped naked on a cold metal table in a sterile white room. My foggy brain struggled to piece together some explanation from how I went from driving home from work to this. Blurry figures moved in my peripheral vision. I tried to lift my head for a better look, but some invisible force held it locked in place. A tall, gangly creature entered my field of vision. He had a bulbous bald head with opaque black eyes and pale gray skin that seemed to glow under the harsh lights. Spindly fingers covered in some sort of black gloves or claws tapped a device it held in its equally spindly hands. I opened my mouth to speak, scream, anything, but quickly realized I was also paralyzed from the neck down. Helpless panic gripped every fiber of my being. The creature must have sensed my terror. In my mind, I heard a thin, reedy voice. "Do not be frightened. We intend you no harm. We only wish to improve your species, to prepare you for what is coming." Invisible claws clamped down on my head, as an excruciating pain ricocheted through my skull. It felt like my brain was being shredded and reassembled as images and concepts flashed before my eyes. Advanced technology, complex mathematics, cosmic disasters, future events. More creatures entered the room and began manipulating my limbs, injecting substances, prodding and poking me. After what felt like an eternity of tests, my overwhelmed mind gratefully slid into unconsciousness. I awoke sometime later back in my car, parked in my driveway. My head throbbed as I tried to piece together if it had all been some bizarrely vivid nightmare. But the lingering pain in my temples and dried blood under my nose told me otherwise. Those creatures, whatever they were, had been inside my head, and they did something to me. In all the days that followed, the changes began. Headaches persisted no matter how many pain pills I took. But I also noticed food no longer satisfied my gnawing hunger. My vision sharpened until I could read license plates from a block away. The strange voices in my head grew louder. I started having vivid premonitions that would come true. A coworker's car crash, an election upset, even trivial things like TV scheduling changes or pop quiz questions. Somehow I could glimpse upcoming events, almost like watching a stream of the future. My body changed, too. I no longer seemed to need sleep, yet woke every morning feeling fully energized. Previously sluggish thinking accelerated to lightning speed. I solved complex equations instantly and remembered entire textbooks, word for word. But the toll was immense migraines that sometimes left me writhing, incapacitated on the floor for hours. At work, I predicted a system failure before it happened, saving us millions. My bosses said I was brilliant. Little did they know alien abductors did something to transform me into a superhuman freak. Part of me wanted to tell the world, to find meaning in my violation, but how could I without sounding insane? The voices in my head had grown to a constant, chaotic chorus only I could hear. They whispered horrors, crashes, explosions, suffering, and death on global scales. I caught glimpses of creatures and spacecraft hidden behind a thin veil that previously concealed them. The experiments performed on me clearly ruptured the flimsy illusion, separating our ordinary reality from levels beyond. I tried drowning the voices out with music, drugs, anything I could think of, but they only intensified. Soon they were screaming, pleading with me to act before the coming cataclysm. I wasn't sure if I was tapping into some real truth or simply going mad. Maybe I already was. The final straw came after a week of ceaseless migraines and zero sleep. In the mirror, my eyes appeared blackened from burst blood vessels. My gums bled spontaneously, and my fingers trembled uncontrollably. How long until whatever alien substance they pumped me with finally killed me? That night, as I rocked and muttered to myself, a booming voice cut through the others, commanding me, "Go to the cave. Our technology can save you and your planet, but time grows short." Somehow I knew exactly the cave it meant, one I had played in as a child on family camping trips. I tore out of my house and sped recklessly into the hills until I came to that familiar rocky outcropping. A perfect full moon illuminated the small black mouth of the cave's entrance. I stumbled inside, not even questioning my surreal actions, lured by a promise of relief from the unrelenting torment. Deeper, I crawled until the narrow walls opened into a large cavern with a glowing blue light at its center. Mesmerized, I stepped toward it. The angry chorus in my head became a single high-pitched drone the closer I came to that glow. I realized my mistake too late. I had walked right into their trap. The force that seized control of my body was even greater than during the first abduction. I was a puppet, compelled by some external power to march stiffly toward that pulsing light, compelled to become something far from human. Just as my hand reached for the hypnotic light, instinct took over. I wrenched back control of my body and let out a primal scream of rage at the creatures who thought they could dictate my fate. With the last of my energy, I ripped a sharp stone from the cavern wall and plunged it into my chest, collapsing as hot blood gushed. I lie gasping on the cold cave floor, life ebbing away, but at least I would die as myself and not their specimen. As my vision faded, I heard their frustrated screams fade to silence. I can only pray my small act of defiance delayed their apocalypse just a while longer, so someone else might find a way to avoid the grim future preordained for our race. A future I glimpsed in my final moments, our planet harvested and humanity mutated into some cold new form. But perhaps we still have time to forge another path. Perhaps. Cancun was a paradise of blue skies and even bluer waters. The ocean was its own world, alive and whispering secrets through the currents. I'd spent the entire year looking forward to this snorkeling trip. My dad used to tell stories about how our ancestors were seafarers, explorers who mapped uncharted waters. I always felt a connection to the ocean that I couldn't explain, like a song whose lyrics I had forgotten, but whose melody stayed with me. On the third day, armed with snorkeling gear and a waterproof camera, I took a boat trip to a secluded reef. The guide, Ricardo, assured me it was an extraordinary spot, a place where the sea unveiled its hidden beauty. As soon as I plunged into the water, I was in another realm. Schools of vividly colored fish danced around me. Corals stretched out like ancient cities, an underwater metropolis teeming with life. I lost track of time, mesmerized by the vibrant underworld. But as I swam farther from the other snorkelers, the scenery began to change. The water got darker, and the corals appeared older, their colors muted. I was about to turn back when something caught my eye. An object half buried in the sand below, its outlines too straight and angular to be a natural formation. Curiosity pulling me deeper, I dove down for a closer look. What I found stopped me cold. A statue, humanoid but not human, its features a surreal blend of aquatic and terrestrial elements. It looked ancient, the material worn away by countless tides. It was the plaque at its base that took my breath away, literally and figuratively. My family's last name was etched onto it, Mendoza. I blinked, half expecting the letters to rearrange themselves, to make this bizarre occurrence some kind of misreading. But they remained, a cold testament set in stone. I took photos, my hands trembling. I had to show this to someone. I had to have proof that this wasn't some sort of underwater mirage. I quickly swam back to the boat, my heart pounding in a rhythm it had never known. When I showed Ricardo the pictures, he looked puzzled, and then concerned. This isn't something I've seen before, and I've been guiding tours for over a decade. You sure about the location? I nodded, pointing it out on the laminated ocean map he had on board. Ricardo scratched his head. That's not a typical spot for tourists. Too many local legends about sea spirits and forgotten gods. The fishermen avoid it. Ignoring my heightened sense of dread, I pressed him for more information. But he shook his head, reluctant to indulge in what he called superstitious nonsense. For the remainder of the trip, I couldn't get the statue and its plaque out of my mind. Who had put it there? How long had it been in the ocean? What did it mean? When I returned home, I showed the photos to my family. They were fascinated, but equally baffled. My dad, always the history buff, tried to dig into our family archives but came up empty. There were gaps in our lineage, periods where records were either incomplete or missing. Looks like our ancestors were good at keeping secrets, he mused. Weeks later, long after the trip was a collection of photos and memories, strange things began to happen. I found myself increasingly restless, a peculiar type of insomnia that left me tossing and turning, the sound of waves echoing in my ears even in the dead of night. Then I started to dream, visions of vast oceanscapes, of ancient rituals, of murmured incantations that seemed to flow from the statue's chiseled lips. Each morning, I would wake exhausted, like I'd been on an endless nocturnal journey. The final straw was the night I woke up to find my bed soaked, as though I'd been submerged in water. The room smelled of salt and seaweed, like a shoreline after high tide. And there on my nightstand sat a small shell, a type I had never seen before, its spirals forming a pattern eerily similar to the designs on the sunken statue's plaque. I booked a return trip to Cancun, this time alone. When I met Ricardo, I could see the unease in his eyes. "You sure you want to go back there?" "I have to," was all I could say. As the boat neared the spot, my heart tightened in my chest. Donning my snorkeling gear, I plunged into the ocean, propelled by a force I couldn't deny. I reached the statue, its presence as unsettling as before. But now it felt like an unfinished chapter, conversation interrupted but not concluded. I took a piece of paper, a waterproof one, and a pencil from my gear. On the paper, I wrote my full name, then pressed it against the plaque, securing it with a small net bag usually used to collect underwater samples. Then I waited. It didn't take too long. The water around me began to churn, the sand swirling like a miniature storm. I felt a pull, not of the current, but something deeper, as if the ocean itself had gripped my soul. My vision blurred, and when it cleared, I was back on the boat, Ricardo staring down at me, his face pale as sea foam. "We need to leave," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. As we sped back to shore, I looked at the photograph of the statue one last time, and then deleted it from my camera. Some mysteries, it seemed, demanded their own form of isolation, their secrets too heavy for the surface world. That night, in my hotel room, I found another shell on my pillow, identical to the first one, but this time it came with a note. "Welcome home." I haven't gone snorkeling since, not because I'm afraid, but because I'm not sure what I'd be returning to, a world of coral and fish, or a lineage that stretches into the dark corners of the sea. And sometimes, when the night is still and the moon casts its glow on the water's surface, I hear whispers, voices that beckon, that plead, that promise. They call to me from depths I can't fathom, asking me to reclaim a legacy that was submerged long before I was born. And I wonder, with equal parts dread and longing, what would happen if I answered.